Okay, we'll now speak to Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan, who's a pediatric intensive care physician. She was last working in Gaza in March and is joining us from Amman. Thanks very much for your time with us on Al Jazeera. So we've just seen an attack on a field hospital in central Gaza with many children among the dead. Now, the doctors, nurses, all the medical staff will be having to make some tough decisions as to who to try to save with the lack of space and lack of supplies. How difficult are those decisions to make? And what are your colleagues on the ground at Al-Aqsa telling you about the situation?
Yeah, I think they're extremely overwhelmed. So I've been getting brief messages saying they're trying to get things under control, but struggling. They said they received upward of 40 martyrs, so people who've been killed, and over 120 injured, mostly women and children. They described terrible burns that were so severe that they were actually scary to look at, horrifying burns covering up to 100% of the body surface area. These patients will not survive. They will gasp. Some of them will survive for hours, maybe a day if it's significantly less than 100%, but they wouldn't survive in any setting. The problem when you have a mass casualty of this scale is you can't even provide compassionate end-of-life care to relieve the suffering. They said that they've been trying to take hold of the situation, but despite this being now several hours ago, that they cannot. They said that reports they're getting from the casualties that are coming in is that this was a triple strike operation where the same vicinity of the medical point, the field medical point, the clinic, where a lot of the cases that would otherwise be cared for at Al-Aqsa are being cared for in this clinic because Al-Aqsa is above capacity. And so they described there being over 1,000 people in the vicinity of that clinic and school, including patients and their caregivers, and that it was hit 3 times. And we've seen this over and over again where places where civilians are highly concentrated are struck by Israeli forces. The rescue workers go in to rescue any survivors, and then the same location is hit recurrently after that, taking not only the few survivors of the initial strike, but also anyone who attempts to rescue them. And so they received a number of casualties, over 100 injuries, a number that any healthcare system would not be able to cope with in terms of managing a mass casualty. One of my colleagues, it's his day off today. They're working very hard. They've been working nonstop for now over close to 9 months. And these physicians generally will work for 24 hours and then have a 24-hour period off. Mm-hmm. And this was his time off, and he was called back in because the situation was so out of control. So he just left me a voice message describing the horrifying injuries that they were seeing. He said it's terrible and completely out of control.
Can you talk more about the pardon me, but can you just talk perhaps a little bit more about the types of injuries that your colleagues are telling you that they're seeing?
I think it depends on the hospital. So we have colleagues at Nasser Hospital, we have colleagues at Al-Aqsa. Today, they're seeing airstrike type injuries. So what I heard was horrifying amputations. One of the nurses who's in the red zone, which is the ICU, was messaging me about 30 minutes ago. And I asked her what type of injury she was seeing. And she said 3 things. She said brain matter out, amputations. So brain matter out is when the brain matter is actually visible because the head has been blown open, amputations and severe burns. My colleague who's at Al-Nasser Hospital, where you're having more troops on the ground, Israeli troops on the ground, said in the last 24 hours they've received multiple women with gunshot wounds to the thighs and legs. And so a lot of gunshot wounds, a lot of tank shelling, and injuries that are related to troops being on the ground. So it really depends, but Al-Nasser Hospital seems to be reporting more sniper attacks, shootings, executions of that type, mm-hmm. and Al-Aqsa reporting more aerial bombardment. That said, both institutions are reporting, majority women, children, elderly. These are, I did see a report saying that several steps were taken to reduce the possibility of civilian casualties. And that's just not the reflection on the ground. I'm sorry. This is clearly a concentration of civilians that has been not intentionally targeted once, but 3 times in a row with an overwhelming majority of women and children casualties. One woman, and this is a report I got about 20 minutes ago from a colleague of mine who's with me in Amman right now. She's part of an NGO a medical NGO that's currently in Gaza. And she shared the story with me of one woman whose husband was killed at the beginning of the war. The woman was pregnant at the time after 13 years of trying to conceive, eventually conceiving with in vitro fertilization with IVF. Her husband was killed at the beginning of the war. She delivered her baby in her tent, and today she was killed. The baby was removed from the rubble alive and is now orphaned, having lost both his parents in 2 separate airstrikes. Actually, I don't know the gender of the child, but both the baby's parents in 2 separate airstrike incidents. I mean, I just want to add one thing, because I'm finding this extremely frustrating, coming on over and over and over again as a humanitarian, asked to offer a humanitarian perspective and a humanitarian solution to what is very clearly on the ground genocide. And you can save a life. We can spend hours resuscitating the people, impossibly trying to keep these people alive. The majority of them will die under the current circumstances and with the types of injuries that my colleagues are reporting in the red area of the emergency department, the most critical area. That said, we can spend hours trying to resuscitate them. But if they survive and they have to go back and live in a quote unquote humanitarian zone that is clearly a valid target, because as a civilian, you are a valid target to Israel. In fact, you're clearly targeted.
Dr. Haj-Hassan, that's what I wanted to ask you about. In fact, let me just jump in there for just a moment, because look, we see hospitals which are supposed to be protected under international law being repeatedly targeted by Israel. I mean, how do you make sense of the fact that there are these repeated violations of international law, yet no accountability?
The reality is, I'm a physician. I'm supposed to make sense of the injury, and I'm supposed to treat it. And I have spent my entire adult career and life investing in my skill set so that I would be very good at keeping people alive. I'm not an international humanitarian lawyer. I'm not an expert in human rights or warfare. I can tell you that the realities on the ground that we are witnessing as people who are supposed to keep people alive is every single means of livelihood, of keeping people alive, from water to food to shelter, safety, healthcare, resuscitative capacity, rescue services, ambulances, waste management systems are targets of the Israeli strategy. Now, you can conclude what you would like. The ICJ seems to conclude it's plausible genocide. The ICC has put out arrest warrants. Everybody's making conclusions that are based on international humanitarian law. For me, on the ground, as a physician who was there and who is now talking to my colleagues who are there, I can tell you that this looks like a strategy to eliminate a population. I don't know what else you could conclude logically, but I'm not an expert that can conclude anything legally, and the legal experts have also spoken.
Okay. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan, for speaking.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.